the listing that's to be found in Deuteronomy already. You get it again in Joshua. The Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. It's almost got a lyrical ring in English. But far more important for our purposes is the formulaic clause, struck down all the inhabitants with the edge of the sword. The first time one reads that Joshua struck down all the inhabitants of the city with the edge of the sword, one makes nothing of it. But then the phrasing or very close variance thereon gets repeated 7 times in close succession in chapter 10, then 2 more times in chapter 11, and in other chapters as well. I haven't actually counted them all up. I think the repetition makes it unmistakable that we are dealing here with a formulaic literary convention. And the formulaic convention, coupled with the fact that Judges hammers home the point that Israel did not by any means wipe out all the population of all the cities that it did battle with, argues for its being a mistake to interpret the clause as meaning literally that Joshua and his troops struck down with the edge of the sword all the inhabitants of the city that they did battle with. To say that Joshua struck down all the inhabitants of a city with the edge of the sword, I mean with the edge of the sword, not with the point of the sword and so forth, but with the edge of the sword, is a way of saying something like Israel scored a decisive victory. Though once you recognize the presence of hyperbole, it's not even clear how decisive the victories were. Joshua did not conquer all the cities in the land, nor did he slaughter all the inhabitants in all the cities that he did conquer. The book of Joshua doesn't say that he did. But on the assumption that Deuteronomy and Joshua are parts of the same sequence of books, then I submit that this interpretation of Joshua forces a back interpretation of Deuteronomy. If struck down all the inhabitants with the edge of the sword is a literary convention when used to describe Joshua's exploits, then it must likewise be a literary convention when used by Moses in his instructions to Israel in general and to Joshua in particular. Remember, this is one sequence edited just before and in the captivity. Yahweh did not mandate that all the inhabitants of all the conquered cities be struck down with the edge of the sword, speaking literally now. All readers of the book of Joshua, not just all readers of the book of Joshua, even those who read it in fragments, not just those who read it in one sitting, will also be struck by the highly ritualized character of some of the major events described. The book is framed by its opening narration of the highly ritualized crossing of the Jordan, and by its closing narration of the equally ritualized ceremony of blessing and cursing that took place at Shechem. And the conquest narrative begins with the ritualized destruction of Jericho. In addition to these ritualized events, there is, as I noted earlier, the mysterious sacral category that's used at some points of being devoted to destruction or being under the ban and the cherem. And no commentator that I read gave me what I regarded as a satisfactory explanation of what that was. So what are we to make of it all? My suggestion is that the book of Joshua has to be read as a theologically oriented narration, stylized and hyperbolic at important points, of Israel's early battles, skirmishes in the Promised Land, with the story of these battles being framed by description of 2 great ritualized events. The story as a whole celebrates Joshua as the great leader of his people, faithful to Yahweh, worthy successor of Moses. If we strip the word hagiography of its negative connotations, we can call it a hagiographic account of Joshua's exploits. The book is not to be read as claiming that Joshua conquered the entire promised land, nor is it to be read as claiming that Joshua exterminated the entire population of all the cities on the command of Yahweh to do so. The candor of the opening chapters of Judges and of Yahweh's declaration to Joshua in his old age that very much of the land still remains to be possessed seems to me clearer to a literal statement of how things must actually have gone. Now, as I said before, the editors of the final texts of Joshua and Judges were not completely mindless. I assume that. So evidently they had no problem with placing next to each other in their multi-volume collection these two ways of narrating Israel's acquisition of the land: the highly stylized, hyperbolic, and hagiographic style of the book of Joshua, and the more down-to-earth style of the opening of the book of Judges. Nor did they even have a problem with preserving a passage in Deuteronomy, which declares that the conquest is going to take a long time, and another which declares that intermarriage among captive populations is allowed. With their report of Yahweh's declaration to the age of Joshua that much of the land remained to be possessed, the editors didn't even have a problem with inserting into the book of Joshua itself an element of the down-to-earth style of Judges. So what are we to make of such dissonance? What would be the point of prefacing a long, multi-volume story of Israel's life in the Promised Land and its exile therefrom with a stylized, hyperbolic, heavily figurative, hagiographic story of how Israel came to be in the land that it inhabited? That story framed by reports of two great ritualized occasions. Well, shall we reach for the deconstructionist line and say that what we have here is an almost paradigmatic example of an ideological history bearing its own deconstruction within it? Gottwald suggests something along these lines. The Deuteronomistic historian of Joshua through 2 Kings appears, he says, as an astute author-compiler who deliberately mixed a profusion of data and interpretations about partial and total conquests in order to show the ambiguous success of Israel in the land as a combination of mixed peoples, many of whom did not fit the profile of later nationalistic orthodoxy. Indeed, the inclusion of the scandalous annals and stories of Judges 1st and 17 may well be a supreme instance of the Deuteronomic historian's ideology of suspicion towards too neat historical interpretations. That's possible, I suppose. The presence of what I call the down-to-earth style in Judges is to be understood, Gottwald suggests, as the editor's way of saying to the reader, don't believe all that stylized nationalistic hagiography that you read in the preceding book. Believe me here in Judges instead. Believe me that things were much messier than Joshua reports them as being. Our blood is not as pure as we would like to think it is. Possible, but in my judgment, not very plausible. For the skeptical editor's intent to have been successful, not only would his own Judges story have had to be more believable than the story he wanted to undermine in Joshua, the ordinary reader would have had to see that that's what he was up to. But if the average reader saw what the skeptical editor was up to, what would be the point of preserving the stylized nationalistic story? I suppose somebody might respond that the nationalists were in a position of power and didn't want to see their Joshua version discarded. But if they had undermined. But if they had the power, why didn't they suppress this obvious attempt at undermining their story? Get rid of Judges. Let me suggest an alternative resolution of the puzzle. Start with this question. Can a people, a nation, employ and hand on two quite different narratives about roughly the same events in its history? One stylized, hyperbolic, and hagiographic, the other down to earth. Can we present-day Americans employ and hand on two such narratives about our own origins? Or do the down-to-earth narratives told by our academic scholars force the disappearance of the stylized narratives by showing them up as heavily fictionalized? Is it still possible for us to tell uplifting stories, stories meant to teach a moral lesson about the noble Puritans in Washington's heroic crossing of the Delaware, about the civil rights struggle and so forth? Or have our academic historians stopped our mouths from telling such stories? My own impression is that though the fate of stylized stories about our past designed to teach a lesson is probably more precarious among us than it was among our predecessors, their fate has not yet been sealed. And let's not overlook the fact that a good many academic writers of history draw a moral lesson for present-day readers from the story they tell. Paul Kennedy's story about the fall of empire and the moral he draws from it for the U.S. Over and over, the storyteller in Joshua declaims as if it were a litany and they slew all the inhabitants with the edge of the sword. Somebody back then replies, but the descendants of some of those inhabitants are living next door to me. To which the storyteller replies, don't be so literal-minded. Finding what might have been the function for Israel of having the story of its origins told as we find it in Joshua. I think his function for Israel in the time of religious reform under King Josiah would have been slightly different from his function for Israel when in captivity, related but different. His function for Israel when still living in the land would have been prophetic, with an emphasis on admonition. I think it's no accident that Joshua comes first among the books of the prophets in the Hebrew Bible. Yahweh gifted Israel with a land flowing with milk and honey, cleansed of the lure of idolatry, in which Israel could live in fidelity to Yahweh. And the book reaches its climax when at the great ceremony at Shechem, the aged Joshua commands, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the pagan gods your ancestors served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you're now living. As for me and my household, he declares, we will serve the Lord. To which the people respond, far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For it is the Lord our God who brought us and our ancestors up from the land of Egypt. Therefore we also will serve the Lord, for he is our God. Israel fails to serve Yahweh alone. That is to be ascribed to the fact that it has not resisted the lure of idolatry. For this it cannot blame Yahweh. It is only itself to blame. But if Israel resists idolatry and worships only Yahweh, it will find that it is blessed.